welcome to this meeting, but also thank you for the invitation to be here for the CCMTA. I've never been to the CCMTA meetings before. I've been actively involved with AMVA for many years. And just as one correction to my bio, I am still with the Washington State Patrol. I've been with them for almost 24 years, and I've served in a variety of capacities. And so I want to kind of give you a little background on me, so you're kind of like, who is this guy from Washington State, and why is he coming here to tell me about legalization of marijuana? Especially a guy that graduated from BYU. So I've always found that kind of a little bit ironic. So never in my 20 years in law enforcement did I ever think that we would legalize a Schedule I drug, especially marijuana, and some of the things that we're seeing and the challenges that come along with that. So today I hope to give you kind of an overview, a lot of questions to think about, not necessarily you should do this, but a lot of things because each of your jurisdictions are different, your laws are different, the way that you prosecute cases is different, so and the way you do toxicology and maybe crash data is different. So a lot of things that I would like you to consider and think about as you go through this. And I know that within the 1 hour time frame that we have, it is not enough to really go into into the weeds of the project. So I just had to figure out how to move that through. But I really welcome any of your questions, and I will be available. I'll be here until Tuesday, so I'll be around if you have any additional questions, because I know that there's a lot of stuff that you have and a lot of concerns that you have, as well as how are we going to make this whole thing work. So first of all, as you had heard my bio, you've seen some of the things that you're seeing within Canada. When I was looking at some different types of materials and pictures and things to add here, I found that this is very interesting. Because in many respects, we know that this is a drug. We know how it impacts human behavior and what it does as far as impairment. And what I think when we look back at Washington is that we never ever thought that the public would vote for it to be legalized here, or in Washington State. So one of the things that I want you to just make sure that you know right away is that this was not passed by a governing body like the legislature. This was a public initiative that was passed, was I-502 in 2012. And we did not actually begin sales in 2014. So there was a lot of myths out there about, oh, it's legal now. Well, no, it wasn't, and it's not legal until we actually have stores open. And then all of a sudden it wasn't until 2014. And what we let happen is we let Colorado be kind of the guinea pigs when they let their stores open. And we did that intentionally to see what kind of challenges that they had, maybe unintended consequences, some things that maybe they hadn't seen before. So we wanted to kind of see how this experiment was going to actually work. And so we kind of intentionally let that happen a little bit so that we could see how we could actually improve the process for our folks in Washington State. We got kind of past the point of, oh my gosh, we can't believe they're going to do this. This is going to, this is bad. It's bad on our youth. It stunts their brain development, so on and so forth. We've had to kind of move out of that paradigm into this is what the public wanted, these are the laws, and now how do we make it work in that process. Doesn't mean we have our own personal opinions about it, but at the same time understanding that now we have a role responsibility to make some of this. So a little background on me. Just personally, this has a huge importance to me because I have a huge family and I have lots of kids. And as you see from this picture, you can go ahead and count them. There is 10 with one daughter-in-law. But this is important because I know how this is impacting their world. And it's impacting them not only in the driving world, but also in their social world, as far as school and everything else, and some of the social pressures that come along with this. So that's why I have taken a real interest in this. And I'll show you a little bit professionally about why this also is important to me. So this is graduation. My wife graduated with her bachelor's degree last year at the age of 50. And so it's never too late to go back to school. So, and lots of mouths to feed. And this is a little family photo just to kind of show a little bit about who I am. Then professionally, like I said, I'm still with the patrol. I am a captain with the Washington State Patrol in 2012. I was fortunate enough to have the governor actually appointed me as the director of our Highway Safety Office. And I'll explain a little more of that in just a second. But I've been with them for 24 years, and I've been with the commission for almost 4.5. And hopefully I'll be able to finish up the administration, and I'm hoping our governor gets reelected, and then I can go another 4. So it'll be kind of a nice thing. But the commission in Washington State is an organization that was founded in 1967 with the sole purpose of helping to reduce fatal crashes and serious injuries in Washington State. And that's across, basically all modes of vehicle, commercial, pedestrian, and bicycle type of transportation. So we have major key holders who are a part of that. The governor is actually the chair of the chair of our commission. And then you have key leadership roles throughout the state, from transportation, the state patrol, licensing, all these major players in the state that have decision-making powers, and they're the ones that help kind of direct policy for us, and then we go and make that happen. I have a small agency of about 23 people, so we handle all of our fatal analysis reporting systems, and we handle a lot of everything related to behavior in traffic safety. Because in the United States, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration provides funds to states to then handle transportation programs, or traffic safety programs, so to say. And that is a federal requirement. And so we are the State Highway Safety Office. So when you see Washington Traffic Safety Commission, that's who we are. We are State's Highway Safety Office. So how many of you know a lot about marijuana? So if you knew the difference between Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or if you knew carboxy, would you know what I meant? Some yes, some no. Do you know what marijuana looks like? Do you know what it smells like? Yeah, I think we all go, ugh. And so I just wanted to, I'm not going to go into a lot of the science of marijuana in the sense of chemistry and all of that, but I just want to give you kind of an overview so that you kind of have a little understanding about when I go through the presentation, you kind of go, okay, now I know what he means. So the first part of it is the main psychoactive substance within marijuana, as we know, is Delta-9. And that's one of the things that I want to really highlight today, is really focusing on what does that really mean, and what does it mean as far as like a per se limit. What does it mean on impairment? So this is the main psychoactive substance found in there. You also have what they call dronabinol or marinol, for like what they have with cancer patients. They use that mainly for nausea and so on, but it doesn't have the high levels of THC where you're going to get high on it. So just to kind of give you a few little things here. Other part is hydroxy, which is it's kind of a metabolite of THC formed in the body after marijuana consumption. Then you have carboxy. And now the carboxy is actual secondary metabolite. So once the high is gone and they do a blood draw or whatever, and they find that you have marijuana in your body, it may not be impairing you, but you still have marijuana in your body. That is referred to as carboxy. And I'm going to tell you why that's important in just a minute. And then you have the metabolites, you have the active type or the inactive, and then you have the psychoactive or the active. As we know, it causes kind of that euphoric or the impairing effects. So like I said, I'm not going to go into a lot of the science because we don't have time today, but I just want to kind of bring out the other issue, what they call cannabidiol, which doesn't have the high THC levels in there, which may have medicinal value, and I'll explain that as well. So just some things here, because with this presentation will be available to you to review, so when you're going back, you can take a look at this, and then some of the references that we provide. So, and then also the per se laws, which is a statutory assignment that, what a state or a province may put on. You may not have more than, like with alcohol, it's like a 0.08 or a 0.10 for alcohol. For marijuana in Washington State, it's 5 nanograms. So in Colorado is 5 nanograms. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So I just wanted to kind of just bring that out just a little bit, just at the very beginning, so when we go through this, and we're going through it pretty quick, you're going to have a better understanding. So everybody understand those now? So if we did a quiz at the end, you'd all get 100%? Okay. So what does the impairment from marijuana do? And I just wanted to show this to you, just to kind of show a couple of little different areas here, so we'll go into the other parts. But there's what they call these cannabinoid receptors that are in our body that impacts, and it impacts people differently. So it impacts parts of the brain as far as the hippocampus, which is our short-term memory, the cerebellum, which is our coordination, and then the basal ganglia, which is the unconscious muscle movements. So when you're thinking of those terms and you're thinking of roadside safety and driving, does that raise some serious concerns? Yeah, absolutely. We all kind of know that there's some issues. No, it doesn't raise any concern? Yeah. So, but these are some things, and it depends on kind of the levels of impairment that there might be out there, that they have within the marijuana itself. But just wanted to kind of show a little bit of just kind of give you an overview of kind of where this impacts. If we can get this to... Also, in your jurisdictions, how many people here, or at least in what you've heard, is that many people want to compare marijuana to alcohol? Do you see a lot of that? It's kind of like, well, if they're at 5 nanograms or whatever, then they must be impaired. Whereas compared with alcohol at a 0.08, we have tons of science, tons of research, tons of information that show those impairing effects at that certain level. But with marijuana, we honestly do not know what that level is. Our state, we put in a 5 nanogram level, and that was nothing more than a guess out of the air that they put into our public initiative. They want to say, well, we were looking at what Europe was trying to do, but the way that Europe actually measures blood concentration is through serum blood and not a whole blood. So there's a difference in the way that it's measured, which if you would do what they did in Europe, that crossover comparison would have been about 2 nanograms. So I would just caution you when you're looking at a per se limit, really look at what the science is telling us. Where is it at? Oregon, their public initiative, decided that they were not going to put in a nanogram level and left that to the legislature to determine. And their legislature came back and said, we're not going to put a nanogram level. What we want to see is the person actually impaired, which we should do anyway, period, without any toxicology. We should be able to show impairment without to have some magic number for impairment. So does that make sense? Okay, so this just kind of just shows little parts of the areas of the brain that it can impact, and some of those things. Just one of the things that people will say, well, how long does it last? When you smoke a bowl, or you're smoking out of a water pipe, or you're smoking out of a vape, all these different devices, or even if we eat it, or if we drink stuff with THC in it, what is the impact on us? How long does it take? And in many respects, for some of the, like the edibles and the drinkables, I'll show you in a minute, we really don't know yet. For smoked, you can see 1 to 30 minutes it reaches its peak effect. The duration of that's about 2 to 3 hours. And then the behavioral and psychological effects can return to kind of back to your homeostasis is about 3 to 5 hours. And then the residual effects may be up to 24 hours. Now with orals, like the oils themselves that they have, 1 to 3 hours, 4 to 8 hours of duration, because it may take 1 to 3 hours for it to actually take effect. There's a case that was in in Colorado, where a young student had eaten a cookie. Have you heard this story? He'd eaten a cookie, and he's like, well, that really didn't do anything for me. So he ate another part of the cookie, and it didn't do anything for him. So he ate another part of the cookie, and he ate, And what happened is he was from Wyoming. He was a student in Colorado, and he got so high that what they see is now he was probably hallucinating, and he ended up jumping off of a 4-story building and thought he could fly. And so these high levels create almost an effect inside where we're seeing high levels of marijuana or THC for folks coming into our hospitals, that they're hallucinating and they're also suffering seizures. And so because of these high levels of concentrations. And so this is, people themselves don't understand. In fact, we have a hospital in Olympia, St. Peter's Hospital, and their chief medical officer was being interviewed by the news and was talking about these concerns about what they call shatter, or marijuana. It's kind of wax, and they have such high concentrations in them that people aren't really sure how to use them, and so they're causing all kinds of problems. And so they were coming into the hospital, some of them in seizures, some of them are hallucinating. There was a lot of issues going on, and they are interviewing the chief medical officer, and he said, this has been almost like an epidemic. We're seeing people coming in over and over and over, and we're seeing this problem. Then they panned off, and they were talking to the marijuana store owner, and he said, this really is a good product. It's just we really need to educate people on how to use them. And I'm thinking, well, okay, you've now given them license and a responsibility to they can use this, but if they don't know how to use it, they are themselves dosing themselves into potentially comas or other medical issues. So this is just a few things here just to kind of see, but a lot of the, coming back to their baseline, residual effects is really dose dependent, and it depends how much they've taken, how much THC they've consumed, and those kind of things. I use this just as kind of as a baseline to kind of start up, to kind of get you thinking about this, because how many of you right now have been around somebody that has been high on marijuana? And would you actually recognize those effects or those signs or symptoms of somebody that's under the influence of marijuana? Now, we're used to alcohol, very used to that, but are we used to seeing what kind of things are related to marijuana? And they may not show all of these, but these are some of the major signs and symptoms that the officers would see roadside, or a drug recognition expert, somebody that they would look at for specifically these types of things. We're so used to seeing the relaxation, the euphorias, the relaxed inhibitions, maybe disorientation, kind of that altered time and space between them, impaired memory and comprehension, lack of concentration, especially on things that they're trying to do. And I'll show you a video in a minute about how people perceive smoking marijuana and then driving after or within 2 hours. Some people think it's not a big deal. They're actually better drivers. And I'm thinking, wow, they must really be a lousy driver. So maybe jumbled thought formation. And then drowsiness. Because what is marijuana? Is it a depressant? So would it cause drowsiness? And managed moods, heightened senses, kind of almost a paranoia type effects. And then also the red bloodshot eyes. You may see a green coating on the tongue or whatever. But if you're eating an edible, you may not see that. Or if you're drinking something, you may not see some of those things that you maybe when you were smoking marijuana. Because we're all so used to seeing Spicoli, right? And how they behaved, and those kind of things. So, but in Washington State, I'll give you just kind of a little background here. In 1998, Initiative 692 passed, and that initiative legalized medical marijuana. Some people said it didn't legalize, it only decriminalized, and really it legalized. And in many respects, it was nothing more than having legalized recreational marijuana. And the reason why is because it was supposed to be able to be an affirmative defense for criminal prosecution, and that you could have no more than a 60-day supply. So in Canada, what's a 60-day supply for medical marijuana? Anybody know? We didn't either. And so that's the question that I have, is what is the 60-day supply? It took almost 9 years, 9 years until we figured it out. So the definition that came back in 2007 is that you could have up to 24 ounces or up to 15 plants. And I highlight 15 plants because I want you to remember that. But there were changes in federal government's enforcement policy. There was a memo that came out from the U.S. Attorney talking about how to handle this. The issues were as far as medical, who could prescribe medical marijuana. You could get this little green card that would then be a recommendation, not a prescription, but who could actually prescribe that? Is it a medical doctor? Is it a naturopath, a chiropractor? Somebody that's never had that background, they could prescribe any of this. There was no regulations over this. So you could have a physician's assistants, advanced registered nurse practitioners. Anybody could really prescribe this. And then we had this one here where we were trying to get a baseline, because in Canada, do you have to have, if you're going to be a medical marijuana patient, are you on a patient register? Yes or no? No? Not anymore? Okay. So we had no patient registry. We had no idea how many people in Washington State were on that or had medical green cards. We had zero idea. And we had no physician registry. So there was no requirements, there was no regulation, there was no oversight of any of that for medical marijuana. Now the question that I have is, back in 1998 and even forward, is how many times have we as a public ever voted for medicine? Zero. Okay? And if it's a medicine and it is truly, facilitating health care, then why isn't it dispensed by a pharmacy? Why is it not handled by a medical professional? Why are these other folks being able to do that? So, and what conditions can you use it for? In our state, you could have hangnail. And I kid you not. That's what they could prescribe it for. Body pain, body tremors, anything that you can think of. We had an attorney that would kid around that saying, hey, dude, I can't stop doing this till I smoke. And you could get a prescription for it. And I kiddingly say that, but ultimately what it was truly, what are those things that you could use it for? Now, some states have gotten down to some very specifics, like you're a terminal cancer patient, you have some serious medical condition, and there's a few things that they've listed, and that's the only thing that you can use it for. Has to be prescribed by a doctor, not just by a naturopath or through a nurse's, a physician's assistant. You had to be a medical doctor to do that. Then the medical community is like, well, how do I even know what dose to give them? And how much THC should they be using? Is THC actually medicine itself? Or are there cannabinoids within the marijuana itself that do provide some medicinal properties without the THC? Is the actual THC medicine? And then there was changes in some of the Seattle's policy where basically it was hands off. So what this ended up happening with our law enforcement community is many of them were like, oh, you have the green card? I'm not going to even touch that, because prosecutors weren't even taking the case. So first came medical. This was kind of our introduction to the legalization of recreational marijuana. So remember 15 plants, okay? And you could be in a medical cooperative where you could have 6 plants for 4 patients, okay? Now imagine having one of those babies. That is not a plant. That's a tree. So when you start thinking about the medical supply for 60 days, and you can have up to 15 of those plants, this raises some serious concerns. And this was taken out of a grow in Oregon. So the way that they have been able to work this and the genetic mutation of being able to, as far as the growing of the marijuana, but also increasing the THC concentrations in marijuana, that is the other piece that is extremely concerning. Our medical marijuana law was not intended to be one that was to provide commercial production or processing. This is where a lot of our people in our own state were confused when they learned some of this, because the law didn't authorize for that. This was supposed to be used for kind of in-grow cooperatives to help medical patients. Sales or other transactions for consideration. It wasn't intended for any of that. This is for medical. Regulation or any type of government oversight. So the law called for no oversight at all for this medicine. And yet we go to the doctor and we need to get an antibiotic or we need to have some other medicine, and we've got to go through a process. He's got to be credentialed, and then we can go down to the pharmacy, we can get that medicine. Now I know there might be some things here in Canada we can get that, may not necessarily be medicine for, but you can understand the process. Those are some of the issues. But this was completely kind of a runaround from it. The right to use medical marijuana. It says the law does not authorize the right to use it. So we're like, well, what did it authorize then? And then the legalization or arrest protection for patients. It was not intended to protect them. It only allowed them to be able to use for medicinal purposes. So the medical marijuana, like I said, no provider list, no patient registry, and no stringent regulatory oversight. So that was 1998. Now fast forward 14 years to 2012, and you have recreational marijuana. So Hemp Fest is a hemp fest, and it's right on Elliott Bay, right in downtown Seattle. They fence it off. You can go in, you can smoke marijuana. You can have all kinds of, you can use anything you want, marijuana related, in the Hemp Fest. So this was just kind of a quick little...
So I'm with the Washington Traffic Safety Commission.
So we sent our staff up to kind of get an idea of what the perceptions would be on the use of marijuana in driving. And we put her in a tie-dyed shirt, so she was camouflaged, kind of blended into the environment. And so they allowed us to just interview them and have just some questions. And it was interesting to hear just the responses.
We might use your, is it okay if we film you?
Yes, ma'am. Is it okay? Yes, it's completely okay for you to film me. However, do you mind the smell of marijuana?
I smoke pretty much every day. I'm a chronic marijuana user and I love it.
It brings me a lot of happiness in a lot of other ways.
I smoked some flower today and made my appetite come back. Ate a bunch of noodles. I'm gonna go eat some donuts now.
Have you been smoking today?
That I have, yeah.
And how are you feeling?
Pretty high.
Can you describe for somebody who's maybe never smoked before what that feels like?
It's sort of like you see things from a different perspective, kind of like it changes the way you think of things almost, and it like makes you feel like this sensation like you're floating on a cloud, kind of.
But yeah, first time users, I would say is most likely like flying or floating, feeling like you're melting maybe.
How does it make you feel? How are you feeling right now?
I'm feeling better than I was before I smoked, and that's all I can say. It makes me happy. It's an antidepressant. I really do think so.
I feel happy for a while, but after a while I do feel run down if I end up smoking too much. Slower reaction times, blurred vision from time to time.
I don't think that I've left the house without smoking before I've left the house. I always smoke first. That's the first thing I do. Just feels good.
We're from the Washington Traffic Safety Commission, and we came to Hemp Fest because we thought it'd be an excellent opportunity to find out more for our own purposes about marijuana and attitudes in the public about marijuana and driving specifically.
I've been doing it since I was 16, so I've had a lot of years of seeing people driving while they're stoned, and I don't see any accidents. I see them driving slow and maybe not paying as good of attention as they should. But I don't see them being reckless or completely oblivious to the conditions around them.
Do you think it's okay to drive stoned?
I mean, probably not, but if you're good enough, like I'm not gonna lie, I've been in the car plenty of times with people that were stoned and they did fine, like it didn't even affect them. And I know a lot of people like that, or are like that, because it's not like alcohol, or it doesn't physically impair you as much that you can't drive straight.
My strategy for smoking marijuana and driving is usually to smoke, wait about 2 hours for the high to mellow down and me to feel back to normal before I will get behind the wheel.
Personally, I have driven while under the influence of marijuana, and I don't see it as an effect on me. I have, driving's one of my passions, so like it's pretty easy for me to drive while I'm stoned, I guess you could say. But like again, I said, it's not necessarily the safest thing to do because it does alter your mind. But
accident. It's not going to be an.
You can
In that way, in that sense.
How do you think it affects your
Me, I don't think it makes any difference. I even sometimes when it's kind of a longer drive, I feel like it's easy to just zone out on the road and just not think about anything else, and marijuana helps me to focus in that way, in that sense.
How do you think it affects your ability to pay attention or your motor skills?
Oh, it definitely relaxes them, slows them down. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't smoke, right? I mean, that's why we smoke. If I wanted to be completely functional, I wouldn't smoke.
That was revelatory to us. Okay, so did you hear what he said at the end? If I wanted to be completely normal, I wouldn't smoke. Okay, so this isn't a criticism to that group, but it's just to kind of bring awareness to the fact that this is what their perceptions are. We did a national roadside survey in Washington State, and when the perceptions came back, that many people felt like they were safer driving after they were high. There were some, and then they also said that they also felt like there was a higher sense of them being caught if they had smoked and driven. So it was like, okay, is it that lack of concentration, memory, what piece? So just part of the issue here. So fast forward 14 years to 2012, we did the recreational marijuana. This was Initiative 502, another public initiative. It was brought forward by the American Civil Liberties Union, really to help focus on the reduction of many people in the marginal communities that were being arrested for marijuana and being imprisoned and so on and so forth. So the idea was, let's just make recreational marijuana legal so that for these patients, and we can only have so much. So it was brought forward. One of the things that we learned from our own public initiative, as a government agency, we weren't able to speak out or kind of run advertisements counter to a public initiative. So in many respects, we were handcuffed, and it was very frustrating because we were trying to put some education out on that. We also had this much budget to do that, whereas they had almost a $6 million war chest, and they had all kinds of people that were pushing the initiative for recreational marijuana. So, the popular travel person, Rick Steves, he was one that helped push forward our initiative in Washington, and Peter Lewis. And this little voters approve I-502, really, it's kind of a historical change for states. And the thing here, it says Washington enthusiastically leapt into history, and the vote was 55 to 45 for passage on that vote. So in the states, we have 39 counties in Washington State, and it was almost split, almost 50-50 as far as those were against and for. And it was interesting because obviously for King County, which is right, is that, guess you can't see it. King is Seattle, and then Pierce and Snohomish. About 54% of our population lives in those three counties. So if you win those three counties, you pretty much win, regardless of what the rest of the state does. So, and that's where we saw a lot of this. So what it legalized was for those who were ages 21 and older, you can possess up to 1 ounce of green vegetable type marijuana material. It obtained from a state licensed store, from private producers, processors, and retailers, and it approved for a tax of 25%, with the 40% of new revenue going to the state general fund, which we thought, yeah, really, it's all cash transactions. I mean, how are we going to track that? And really, is the state going to actually get that much money, and so on and so forth? It also, let's see if it's the next one. Well, so it put regulation in place for recreational marijuana as compared to medical marijuana, because it's only dealt with recreational. So our liquor control board at the time was the one that was managing statewide liquor stores, and in 2011, public voters voted that out, and the Liquor Control Board lost 1,400 employees from that initiative. And so the next year, the public initiative called for the Liquor Control Board to be the regulatory agency in Washington State to manage They had 0 employees, 0 budget, and nobody in the agency except for the deputy chief of enforcement, who used to work for me, knew anything about marijuana. So they now all of a sudden got this dumped on their lap. And so they have had to go through. The process called for a seed-to-sale tracking, which much like they do right now in the agricultural industry for like corn, wheat, so on and so forth. They can see the DNA and exactly which farm it comes from. If it's not in that database, then they can come in and confiscate the marijuana from a store. Testing and labeling requirements, which I'll show you in a second, which is really critical because many of the manufacturers for medical or edibles for marijuana were basically copycatting many of the candy industry's packaging for gummy bears for Mr. Goodbar and some of the other like Twinkies and Reese's peanut butter cups and so on and so forth. But also the serving size limits. It didn't limit the amount of THC in that serving size. It just had serving size limits. And then the product restrictions and then a specific taxation. Because the whole idea was, and part of their messaging was, well, this is going to get rid of the black market. Well, with taxes and all the other requirements and regulations, the black market is still making as much money as they used to. So when you look at recreational versus medical, there was a few things here I just want to show to you. In Washington, you could have up to 1 ounce of usable material, 16 ounces of infused product, which is a food or some type of a solid, like brownies, that's one that we commonly refer to, 72 ounces of liquid, so like a soda pop, and you think about your 44-ounce big gulps or whatever, now you're talking about 72 ounces. And how much is a gallon? Like 64 ounces? So you could have more than a gallon of liquid infused product with marijuana in it, and there's no THC limit. So, concern, 7 grams of concentrate, or what they call hash oil. It was illegal to grow your own. It had to be lab tested and controlled for pesticides. This is recreational. Now, if you look at marijuana or medical, you could have up to 24 ounces. You could grow 15 plants. They weren't dispensaries, we called them cooperatives. But there was no lab testing and no pesticide control. Now that seems completely contradictory if we're talking about medical marijuana. Then you have ages 18, and even providers could provide that. It wasn't taxed. So many of the folks said, well, why would I want to be a recreational marijuana? I'll just go down and get my green card and I can have more marijuana, I can use it more, and it's not taxed or anything like that. So what we had to look at, and our legislature, in fact, our initiative said that the legislature cannot change any substantive portions of the initiative for 24 months. So they were handicapped or handcuffed for quite a while. So then they did some alignment. And this alignment then helped to bring in some issues as far as the regulation of medical use marijuana. Our Department of Health then was given the authority to identify specifically who could prescribe and how it was going to be used. Specific requirements for patients under the age of 18. So now our new law says if you are under the age of 18, you can go in to a marijuana store that sells medical marijuana, and there's a little line in the store that shows recreational half and then the medical half, and they can go in as long as they're with their provider, and their provider can then pay for that. So I'm thinking, how many doctors are going to go to the store with their patient to get the medical marijuana? So that might have been part of the science behind that. So, and then they'd have a single system for licensing the production, processing, and retail sales, because they realized later on that the way that they were taxing the marijuana was actually encouraging the black market sales. And so they tried to bring it down so then that the price levels were then very comparable to the black market. Then the other part of it was to have some consistent testing and labeling and then product standards. And the reasons for that is so that you wouldn't have those. So we have had kids that have gone over to grandma's and grandpa's house or to aunt and uncle's, and they have seen something very similar to this. Do you like the pot tarts? Yeah. So some of these manufacturers have actually gone over to sue for copyright violations and some other things, but it also creates a lot of confusion, especially with kids, because they see this and they think, hey, those are Reese's peanut butter cups. So we've also seen what we have seen in our data, and one thing that you may want to look at are poison control calls related to marijuana. We have seen a a huge spike, especially in kids 2, 3, and 4 years old, because they get a hold of this stuff and they don't know any different. Most of them can't even read marijuana or know what THC is, and they have actually been exposed to this. You're not going to necessarily overdose, die from marijuana, but the drug itself, but your actions as a result of could, just like the student or as a driver. So the federal law, as you know, in the United States, it is against federal law. So the question comes up is, how do you get around that federal law? How is the state just thumbing its nose at the federal government saying, we're going to do it anyway? So this was a public initiative. Like I said, it has been adopted into Washington, Colorado. Oregon has now passed one. Alaska and D.C. Has a version. So the U.S. Attorney put out this memo and specifically told the states, if you want to keep your marijuana laws, there are 8 things that you have to monitor and you need to maintain and watch for. These are not in any prioritized order, but I put them in my prioritized order, was to prevent youth access. We have more youth access than we've ever had. And there's almost really hardly any way to control that. And then prevent an increase in drug driving. And I'll show you the stats here in a second that we're still, I'll tell you in a second. And then prevent travel across borders, as between our partners between Canada and the United States, Mexico. Prevent increases in illegal grows in government land, especially on state-owned land and federal lands. And then diversion and pot use on federal property is still illegal. The other question, too, that came up to us is, well, now that it's legal, can we smoke it as state employees? And I said, no, because we have a drug-free policy, and we still receive federal funds. You can't smoke, even off duty. And they were like, are you sure about that? And that actually got challenged in our state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court backed that up. Said employers can still have a drug-free workplace. Now, the question that I have for you is, if this became a federal law and you have drug-free policies, what kind of impacts would that have on you? I mean, I'm not going to answer your question, but those are some things to think about as far as your own employees. So the regulatory industry came in place. The Liquor Cannabis Board, they actually kept their same acronym as LCB. So they dropped the Liquor Control and made it the Liquor Cannabis Board. And they that way it saved them a lot of money in their stationery. So the Department of the Liquor Cannabis Board, the Department of Health, the Department of Revenue, the State Patrol, legislative groups have gotten together. If you don't have some group that's already working together in combination, I would highly recommend, and that is one of my biggest recommendations for all of you, is organize a group that can start looking at this from all perspectives. And I would invite the marijuana industry, because they have a vested interest in this as well. And I know that sounds a little bit controversial, and I know that may go, but Colorado did it, and they found a lot of usefulness in that, because there were perspectives that they brought to the table that they hadn't really thought of. So think about a group that actually is organized and has kind of represents those multiple disciplines, because from that you can start looking and addressing this from a much broader perspective. Because how are you going to regulate it? How are you going to enforce it? Who's going to get it? What happens if there's violations? What are the judges going to do? What are the prosecutors going to do on cases? As soon as 502 passed, there were about 6,000 minor possession charges in King County and Pierce County that the prosecutors just dumped. As soon as it was passed, the prosecutors just dumped them. Said, no longer a problem. So those are some things. How will that be impacted? So in Washington State, the Liquor Cannabis Board has issued about 398 licenses for people to sell marijuana. And, 378. But only 258 of those are actually reporting sales. Now, they may have gotten their license and they're just getting their building set up and getting production and stuff, so they may not have necessarily opened, but they have a license to sell. And they're thinking now, and that's as of Friday, is they're thinking now with the new medical requirements that the grow canopy that they have authorized of about 13.8 million square feet may have to grow, no pun intended, but they're looking at that. There's 748 producers and or processors just in Washington State that are providing the marijuana. So, in some form. So, the sales, this is not a typo. This is right off of the dashboard, and if you want to, you can go out and look at this particular website, and you can look at their daily it's a weekly dashboard. And right now, they are seeing $3.3 million in average daily sales. We have a population of 7.2 million people. So it's 3.3 million a day. In fiscal year 2015, about 259 million, about 65 million in tax obligation. In 2016, we're $908 million, and the tax obligation right now is $170 million, and that's just through June. So you can see this is a massive industry. Now, if any of you are interested, I'm thinking about retirement. And I'm thinking, how many of you have a Redbox movie? You know what a Redbox is? Okay. A Redbox is a dispensary where you can go in and you can pick out the movie, you put your credit card in and it dispenses the movie and you can go home. I'm thinking about a green box. And I can have suckers and candy and all kinds of stuff. What do you think? I know, bad idea. So, but this just kind of gives you an idea about the regulatory process and some of the issues. The Liquor Cannabis Board now has to hire people, and they're hiring several at high rates to be able to keep up with the demand here as far as the enforcement. So now the question has been asked of me. Since your legalization, have you seen an increase in fatal crashes as a result of marijuana or the legalization of marijuana? The big question for that is yes, and it's too early to tell. So, but we see through a lot of meta-analysis and a lot of studies that show that marijuana doubles your crash risk. And you've heard people say, well, it's not as dangerous as alcohol. Well, we know that at certain levels of as far as your BAC, that it may quadruple your crash risk, or it may be up to 20 times your crash risk, or increase your crash risk by 20 times, depending upon what level you're at. So I'll get to that in a second. But we know that some of the meta-analysis shows it doubles your crash risk. We know what it affects. Your motor conditions, your thought process, maybe your time distance, some of those things. The drowsiness. So, but we see a lot of crashes as far as drivers involved in fatal crashes show a high frequency, literally, of the combining of marijuana and alcohol. And that's what we've seen a significant increase with that. But marijuana has always been kind of the highest drug in fatal crashes. Now, the big question is, was the marijuana the cause of the fatal crash? Were they actually impaired by marijuana at the time of the crash? So that's another question to think about. And what we're also seeing is because of some issues, we had a U.S. Supreme Court that came down talking about getting blood for an impaired driver, issues like they call McNeely versus Missouri. We've also had some issues with legalization of marijuana, and now what we're seeing is because of the complexity of DUI cases, we've actually seen our DUI citations drop from about 42,000 DUI arrests a year down to about 24 to 25,000, which the DUIs have not stopped. It's just the arrest complexity in some of this has gotten even worse. Because now we have our Supreme Court right now in Washington State is considering, and what I heard right before I left on Friday is that, do you have an implied consent warning for breath? So if you're stopped by an officer, it's implied that you would give consent to a breath test. It would be a criminal offense if you refuse? Yeah. Well, in Washington State, they're thinking of making the implied consent warning for breath unconstitutional, period. So if you have probable cause to believe that somebody is impaired by alcohol or drugs, it's now going to force our officers to get a search warrant for breath. Which I think, Debbie, you'd go, they're out of their mind. So that's creating another issue that we're dealing with. What about phlebotomy? Who's going to do the actual drug test? Do you have to take them down to a hospital or a medical professional to draw the blood? Or could you train your officers to do that roadside? These are all huge things right now that when you start thinking about, we are, I think, as far as the theme of this conference is shine a new light on ideas, or however that is we're now having to shine a light on things that we thought, that might be okay maybe down the road. But they're things now we need to start thinking about. Because right now, our state legislature passed phlebotomy for law enforcement officers. And a lot of our chiefs and sheriffs are struggling with that aspect, thinking there's too much liability for my officers to put a needle in somebody's arm. I'm thinking, you gave them a gun. And you gave them authority to arrest people. And there's some things there that I think we're going to have to look at to how to process these, because right now some of our DUIs are taking 4 and 5 hours to process. Just to get the search warrant, get it processed, get the judge to sign it, get somebody to take the blood, you're talking 4 hours. That's a huge resource drain for a chief or a sheriff or a constable or somebody else. So when you look at the literature, you're going to see a variety of issues. So I mentioned about how alcohol or marijuana, it doubles your crash risk, or it's maybe 4 times. Drowsy driving, you're going to see this in the literature, is that alcohol from less than 0.12 is either 20 or up to 200 times. The ranges between 0.5 and 0.8, 30 to 5. You're going to see all these different ranges in the literature. So, but the question is they say, well, marijuana is safer than alcohol. Well, the lesser of two evils is still what? Is still evil. Regardless, to say it's safer than alcohol, I guess, is true in some respects, but it's still dangerous to be putting that. Then you add the next layer. What happens now when you mix marijuana with alcohol or drugs, such as Xanax or a Percocet? Like a fatal crash that we just had in Olympia, where they had a Xanax, a Percocet, they had smoked marijuana, and there was one more drug, and he had fallen asleep, came through an intersection, and killed 2 people. He was in the back seat of a patrol car, and the officer said he just kept falling asleep. He's like, sir, can you stay awake? He couldn't. So, but it's those drug mixtures. The idea in itself to... Okay. So we've been through that. But the other thing I want you to think about is some of the research that's been done out there. We kind of see and kind of kid about the old 70s and Woodstock, and but that marijuana was about 3%. And then we see it increase to about 10% about 2008. What we're seeing in Washington State as far as our just regular smoked marijuana is up to 29% THC. You're seeing oils and concentrates go up to almost 92%. So those are huge, huge issues. And then you look at the government research that's been done. Do you know what level they use? It's 3%. So, and really, basically because it's against federal law. And it's hard for universities to get an IRB or an institutional review board approval to do human subject studies with marijuana or other drugs. So, but then they'll use this saying, well, it only doubles your crash risk. Yeah, but at what level? At what level and how much usage? And what about just the new user versus the chronic user? So those are just some things to think about. This is what we've seen. The green line is cannabinoids, obviously. You can see our fatal crash picture. It's that we've seen over since this is a 14-year period, actually about 15, 2001 to 15. The green line, you can see where our depressants, the stimulants, and down at the bottom, stimulants and then hallucinogens. But marijuana has always been one of those drugs that's always been seen in our fatal crashes. I'm not going to go through this but we had developed a report because we wanted to know for ourselves, have we seen an increase? And what we did, because what most states and jurisdictions look at is, did they have marijuana in their system? And they'll say, yeah, there was marijuana in the system. But it could have been the fact that it was already the carboxy, we talked about at the very beginning. It could have been the burned off part. And they were still counting that as part of their fatal crash. So we went back and looked at how many of our fatal crashes actually had the delta 9 at the time of the blood draw, or at least presumed at the time of the crash. Because with alcohol, you can extrapolate back a certain amount of time and be able to say they were probably about right in here. Can't do that with marijuana. We have no idea what that extrapolation level would be. So we developed a report. This is on my website. Let's see right here at wtsc.wa.gov under publications. And it has that title, Driver Toxicology Testing. It's a 62-page document in case you have a little problem sleeping. It's available for you, but it outlines clearly all the issues specifically related to marijuana and marijuana use in fatal crashes. And looking at over this, that from 2010 to 14, looking at drivers themselves and how many of them actually had a Delta 9 THC in their body. So we have seen an increase, but it wasn't like we anticipated. We expected to see this huge spike, but we have seen an increase, and I'll give you this one here. This is just kind of from the executive summary of our report, is that we have seen the frequency of drivers in fatal crashes that tested positive for active Delta 9 or the THC. Alone with other drugs, it was highest in 2014 with 75 drivers compared to the previous 4 years with 36. So yes, we have. The question, though, that all researchers would say is that a result of your legalization? Most of us would say, duh. But the other part of us would say, well, was there anything else that was, affecting that? So then we looked at the frequency of drivers tested with alcohol greater than or equal to 0.08 and no other drugs. And it was the lowest in 2014 at 51 as compared to the 98 over the 48-year average, or the 4-year average. Then in 2014, 84.3% of driver tested positives for cannabinoids were positive for an active Delta 9 THC as compared to 44% over the 2010. So you can see have seen an increase. So what my researcher did, she's a pesky young lady, and she said, I wasn't satisfied to just see the, just the Delta 9, but I wanted to see was what was their actual levels. So we went back to 2012, I think it was 2012 forward, and looked at, and we have seen about 45% of the drivers actually had a Delta 9 THC that was around 5 nanograms, as compared to in 2015, it was like 96%. So it's looking at what are those concentrates, what is the actual levels. Our average toxicology for our THC is about 6 to 7, almost 8 nanograms. That's the average. But we have seen it as high as 100 or even higher. So, and I can't imagine what 100 nanograms of marijuana in the body does, but it's high. So this is also will be in the presentation just to show kind of this increase in all areas. And then we see about 50% of all of our fatals are impaired drivers, but we've seen a significant increase as far as drugged driving. And what we have seen since 2000, really about 2011, is that this green line is all drugged driving as compared to alcohol. And we've seen our alcohol fatals dropping, and one thing we never thought we would see, but now we're seeing our drug driving is eclipsing alcohol. So one of the issues, obviously, is the enforcement of it. This is a fatal crash involving a marijuana-involved driver, crosses the center line, probably fell asleep or dozed off. There's a lot of data in here that I can show you, but one of the things I just wanted to show you, these are the different types. You've got suckers that are very attractive to children, juices, grape cannabis quencher, e-cigs, the dabs. And what's hard about e-cigarettes or vaporizers is that they don't leave an odor. So a teacher could have somebody in the back. They even have inhalers that they can heat up so quick and so hot that you can, and it's marijuana. And the teacher may see them, think that they're on an inhaler, but it's actually marijuana, and it doesn't leave an odor. So they're getting high right in the classroom. So those are some things that as you start looking at this, it starts getting a little more concerning. So these are just a few things here. Poison control. We did a roadside study that I just got the data on. We had, and it incorporated breath tests, saliva, blood, and a knowledge and awareness survey. And we were shocked that almost 75% of the people that came through actually gave us blood. And the reason they gave us blood is because we gave them $50. So if you came through and got an oral test, it was $10, $50 for a blood test. And so it was like a night out. They came down and did it. But it was a random survey. all run through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, through the Pacific Institute of Research and Evaluation, who did this evaluation. And these are just some of the questions that we had asked. Have you ever used marijuana within 2 hours? Yes. Said that if you'd used marijuana within the last 2 hours, how do you think it affected your driving? Did not make my driving any difference in my driving, 62%. Made me a better driver? I don't know. And then 877 people were questioned, how likely do you think it's marijuana impairs a person's ability? 47% said very likely. Or now 19%, so almost 68% of the people said very likely or likely that it was, but it makes me a better driver, or it doesn't make any difference in my driving. 881, how likely do you think it is a person could be arrested to impaired driving using marijuana within the last 2 hours? Pretty high. They could get arrested. So what the reason I bring that up is if you haven't got baseline data that shows marijuana use, especially with youth, a Department of Health does a healthy youth survey every single year. And they survey 10 and 12th graders. And what they have found is that marijuana use has gone up significantly from 10th and 12th grade. I mean, it's actually our Department of Health is seeing an alarming issue with our youth because we know of the long-term studies as far as use of marijuana and the impacts it has on the brain. So ultimately, those are some of the issues that we're dealing with, but what's amazing is that we have come together as a coalition to be able to look at specific areas that we have responsibility for, but also looking about how do we help each other in those areas. So our governor has a Results Washington where we go through and we address certain issues, and this is one of his goals, is to address the impacts of marijuana and utilizing those goals. Okay. Thank you.